The hammer fell with a decisive crack, and Miss Cordelia Ashworth could scarcely believe her victory. She had just outbid the most powerful duke in England for a Renaissance masterpiece, using her entire inheritance of £50 against his seemingly limitless fortune. But as Alexander Blackthorne, Duke of Ravenshollow, approached with predatory grace, his storm-grey eyes holding dangerous amusement rather than defeat, Cordelia realized her triumph might have been premature. When he murmured congratulations with a smile that promised retribution, she had no idea he would purchase the entire Phillips auction house within days, then arrive at her modest lodgings personally delivering her painting with an offer that would change everything. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning light filtering through the tall windows of Phillips' auction house cast golden rectangles across the polished wooden floors, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like tiny spirits hovering over treasures, waiting to find new homes. Miss Cordelia Ashworth stood before Lot 47, her gloved fingers clasped tightly behind her back, as she studied the small painting with an intensity that would have surprised anyone who knew her current circumstances as companion to the elderly Mrs. Pemberton. The canvas, no larger than a prayer book, depicted the Virgin Mary cradling the Christ child. Their faces rendered with a delicate luminosity that spoke of Renaissance mastery despite the auction house's modest attribution to School of Raphael. Cordelia's father, the late Sir Thomas Ashworth, had possessed one of the finest scholarly minds of his generation, and under his tutelage she had developed an eye for art that rivaled many professional connoisseurs, though such expertise had proven a poor substitute for the dowry that financial ruin had swept away along with the family's extensive collection. Now, at 26, she haunted auction houses not as a buyer, but as a dreamer, her modest grey pelisse and carefully mended gloves marking her as one of those genteel poor who clung to the edges of society, so sustained by memories of better times and the bitter knowledge that breeding without fortune was merely a prettier form of poverty. The Madonna's eyes seemed to follow her as she moved closer, noting the subtle gradations of color in the flesh tones that suggested a master's hand rather than a student's careful copying, the way the light fell across the Virgin's veil with an understanding of fabric and shadow that spoke of direct observation rather than academic exercise, and most tellingly, the peculiar way the infant's hand was positioned, curled in a gesture she had seen in only one other work, a documented early Raphael that had passed through her father's hands years before their downfall. The auction room filled gradually with the usual mixture of serious collectors, curious society figures, and dealers seeking bargains, their conversations creating a low murmur that mixed French, Italian, and English as easily as tea blended with milk. But Cordelia barely noticed them, so absorbed was she in the painting that she had begun to suspect might be one of the greatest discoveries of the decade, if her instincts proved correct. The arrival of Alexander Blackthorne, 5th Duke of Ravenshollow, changed the very atmosphere of the room as surely as a storm front rolling across the countryside, his tall frame and commanding presence drawing every eye even as conversations faltered and resumed in more subdued tones. At 32, he possessed the kind of dark, aristocratic handsomeness that made debutantes swoon and their mothers calculate marriage settlements. But it was the intelligence burning in his grey eyes and the air of absolute authority that surrounded him like an invisible cloak that marked him as truly formidable. Cordelia had never seen him in person, but his reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning, whispered in drawing rooms as the story of a man who had tripled his already vast inheritance through investments that others called recklessly bold and he deemed merely logical, who could destroy a political career with a word in the right ear, or elevate a nobody to prominence with his patronage, and who remained utterly unmarried despite a parade of hopeful candidates thrown in his path by ambitious families. He moved through the auction room with the fluid grace of a predator, his impeccably tailored coat of midnight blue superfine emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders, his cravat arranged with mathematical precision, every detail of his appearance speaking of wealth so vast that it need not advertise itself through ostentation, but could afford the luxury of understated perfection. When his gaze swept the assembled lots, cataloguing items with the casual attention of a man accustomed to acquiring whatever caught his fancy, Cordelia felt an unexpected flutter of nervous energy, as though she stood too close to a fire that might warm or consume without warning. She forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the auctioneer's preparations, but remained acutely aware of the Duke's presence as he took a position near the front of the room. His hands clasped behind his back in an unconscious mirror of her own posture, though where she stood from necessity to avoid notice, he commanded attention simply by existing in the space. The bidding began with lesser items, small pieces that drew modest interest from the assembled crowd, but Cordelia found her attention scattered, her usual focus compromised by an awareness that the Duke's eyes occasionally swept the room in a way that seemed to catalogue not just the artwork, but the people present, as though he found the human drama as worthy of study as the Renaissance masters whose works adorned the walls. When Lot 47 was finally called, her heart began to race with an intensity that surprised her, for while she had often admired pieces beyond her reach, she had never before felt such a compelling need to possess something, to rescue it from potential misattribution and give it the recognition it deserved. The auctioneer's description was perfunctory, mentioning the attractive subject matter and pleasant execution while noting the attribution to Raphael's workshop rather than the master himself, and Cordelia watched with growing excitement as the opening bid of £10 drew only scattered interest from dealers looking for decorative pieces to sell to less discerning clients. She waited until the bidding seemed to stagnate at £20, her palms damp within her gloves as she considered the enormous risk she was about to take. For the £50 left to her by dear Mrs. Pemberton was meant to secure her future independence, perhaps allowing her to establish herself as a teacher or companion without the desperate need that made such positions little better than genteel slavery. But the painting called to her with a voice that seemed to whisper of vindication for her father's memory, of proving that the knowledge he had given her possessed value beyond mere accomplishment, and when she raised her hand to bid £22, she felt as though she stood at the edge of a precipice, ready to leap into unknown territory. The Duke's attention turned to her then, drawn by the unexpected challenge to what he had clearly assumed would be an easy acquisition, his grey eyes studying her with the same intensity she had devoted to the painting, and she felt exposed under that penetrating gaze, as though he could read not just her determination, but the desperate hope that drove it. The moment when their eyes met across the crowded auction room seemed to stretch like taffy in the summer sun, filled with a crackling tension that Cordelia attributed to her audacity in challenging one of England's most powerful peers for what he had obviously decided to acquire. Alexander Blackthorne's bid of £30 was delivered with casual confidence, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to having his wishes respected without question. But when Cordelia countered with 35, using nearly 3/4 of her entire inheritance in a gesture that felt like throwing her future onto the altar of instinct, something shifted in his expression, a flicker of what might have been surprise quickly replaced by interest. The room had fallen utterly silent now, society matrons leaning forward in their chairs to witness the extraordinary spectacle of an unknown woman daring to compete with the Duke of Ravenshollow, their fans fluttering like butterfly wings as whispered speculations filled the air about her identity and presumption. Cordelia felt every eye upon her, but her focus remained fixed on the painting, on the gentle curve of the Virgin's smile that seemed to hold secrets about technique and artistic development that could revolutionize understanding of Raphael's early period, if only she could prove her suspicions correct. When the Duke raised his bid to £40, she sensed his growing curiosity overriding his desire for the piece itself, as though the contest had become more interesting than the prize, and she realized with a mixture of terror and exhilaration that she had captured the attention of one of the most dangerous men in London. Her final bid of £50, spoken in a voice that trembled only slightly, despite the magnitude of what she was risking, represented not just every penny of her security, but a leap of faith in her own knowledge and judgment, a declaration that she would rather face an uncertain future than live with the regret of allowing potential genius to disappear into obscurity. The silence that followed seemed to last an eternity, broken only by the soft tick of the long case clock in the corner, and the rustle of silk as ladies shifted in their seats, waiting to see whether the mysterious bidder had finally overreached herself against impossible odds. Alexander Blackthorne stood in the marble entrance hall of his Mayfair mansion, still holding his gloves and walking stick, yet making no move to hand them to the hovering footman who waited with the patience born of years serving the aristocracy. The encounter at Philip's auction house played through his mind with the persistence of a melody that refused to be dismissed, each detail crystallizing with remarkable clarity, despite the chaos of emotions that had followed Miss Ashworth's unexpected victory. He had attended the auction with the casual intention of acquiring a pleasant decorative piece for one of his lesser properties, his interest in the small Madonna based purely on his secretary's recommendation that Renaissance works were performing well in the current market. But what had transpired in that crowded room had shaken something fundamental in his understanding of himself and his place in the world he had so carefully constructed. The woman who had outbid him possessed something he had not encountered in years of navigating London's social waters, a genuine passion that transcended calculation and self-interest, and her knowledge of art had been evident not just in her willingness to risk everything for a single painting, but in the way her eyes had studied the piece with the intensity of a scholar rather than the acquisitive gleam of a collector. When she had spoken her name, Ashworth, with such dignity despite her obvious reduced circumstances, he had felt an unexpected jolt of recognition, for he remembered Sir Thomas Ashworth as one of the few men in academic circles whose reputation for integrity had been matched only by his expertise, and the realization that this extraordinary woman was the great scholar's daughter had added layers of complexity to his fascination that he was only beginning to comprehend. Now, in the familiar surroundings of his own domain, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power that had never failed to provide satisfaction before, Alexander found himself restless and distracted, his usual evening routine of reviewing correspondence and estate matters abandoned in favor of pacing the length of his study while his mind returned again and again to the moment when Miss Ashworth had lifted her chin in defiance of his position and declared her expertise superior to his own. The audacity of it should have offended him, would certainly have earned his displeasure from anyone else, but instead he found himself admiring the courage it had taken for a woman in her circumstances to challenge him so directly, and the memory of her voice, cultured but carrying the slight tremor of nerves she had tried so hard to conceal, haunted him with its mixture of pride and vulnerability. The investigation into Miss Cordelia Ashworth's circumstances proved both easier and more illuminating than Alexander had anticipated, for his network of information sources extended throughout London society like an invisible web that caught whispers and rumors as efficiently as any spider caught flies. Within 24 hours of their encounter, he possessed a complete picture of her life that painted a portrait of sacrifice and dignity that both impressed and disturbed him in ways he had not expected. Sir Thomas Ashworth had indeed been a scholar of exceptional reputation, his collection of Renaissance art considered one of the finest private assemblages in England, but his unworldly nature had made him easy prey for unscrupulous investment advisers who had gradually stripped away his fortune through schemes that promised vast returns while delivering only devastating losses. When death had claimed him 3 years prior, his estate had been so encumbered with debt that the entire collection had been sold to satisfy creditors, leaving his 2 daughters virtually penniless despite their gentle birth and superior education. The younger daughter, Imogen, had been fortunate enough to attract the attention of a respectable gentleman whose modest fortune allowed him to overlook her lack of dowry. But Alexander's sources revealed that this apparent good fortune had come at considerable cost to Miss Cordelia, who had used what remained of her own inheritance to ensure her sister's marriage could proceed without the stain of financial desperation. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had systematically sacrificed her own prospects to preserve her family's honor and her sister's future, accepting her position as companion to elderly Mrs. Pemberton, not from lack of alternatives, but from a determination to maintain independence while fulfilling her obligations to those she loved. Such selfless devotion to duty struck a chord in Alexander's carefully guarded heart. For he recognized in her actions the same sense of responsibility that had driven his own decisions throughout his adult life, though his circumstances had allowed him to fulfill his obligations while accumulating rather than surrendering wealth and position. The realization that Miss Ashworth possessed not only the expertise and courage he had witnessed at the auction, but also the moral character to place others' welfare above her own comfort elevated his interest from mere intrigue to something approaching reverence. And for the first time in years, he found himself contemplating actions driven by emotion rather than cold calculation. The opportunity to transform his interest into action presented itself with the symmetry of a perfectly plotted drama when his secretary reported during their morning meeting that Philip's auction house was facing severe financial difficulties that threatened its continued operation. The establishment had been struggling for months with declining attendance and increased competition from newer, more fashionable venues, and the owner was quietly seeking a buyer willing to assume both the property and the substantial debts that came with it. Alexander listened to this intelligence with growing excitement, recognizing immediately that fate had presented him with the perfect means to advance his courtship of Miss Ashworth while simultaneously making a sound business investment that would complement his existing interests in the art market mounts. The purchase of Philip's would give him control not only of a respected auction house, but also of the very venue where he had first encountered the remarkable woman who had captured his imagination so completely, and the romantic gesture of acquiring the entire establishment simply to ensure her painting remained safely in her possession appealed to something in his nature that he had long suppressed in favor of practical considerations. His decision was made before his secretary had finished explaining the financial details, and by afternoon he had instructed his man of business to begin negotiations with an urgency that surprised even his most experienced advisers, who had grown accustomed to their employer's methodical approach to all transactions. The acquisition moved forward with remarkable speed. Smoothed by Alexander's reputation for decisive action and his willingness to pay a premium for immediate completion, and within 48 hours he found himself the owner of one of London's most established auction houses, a purchase that his friends would no doubt attribute to his genius for recognizing profitable opportunities, but which he knew had been motivated entirely by his desire to impress a woman whose good opinion had somehow become more valuable to him than the respect of Parliament or the approval of society. The decision to deliver Miss Ashworth's painting personally represented another departure from Alexander's usual careful protocols, for his position normally required that such communications be handled through intermediaries who could maintain appropriate distance between a duke and those of lesser station. Yet the thought of delegating this particular task to a secretary or footman felt not merely inappropriate, but almost sacrilegious, as though the gesture would lose all meaning if stripped of his personal involvement and reduced to a mere business transaction. He had the painting carefully examined by his own expert, who confirmed Miss Ashworth's extraordinary eye by declaring the piece to be not merely School of Raphael, but quite possibly an authentic early work by the master himself, making her victory at the auction even more remarkable and her expertise even more impressive than he had initially realized. The knowledge that she had recognized genius where trained professionals had seen only competent craftsmanship added another layer to his admiration, confirming that her passion for art was matched by scholarly understanding of the highest order. On the morning of his intended visit, he spent an unusual amount of time selecting his attire, settling finally on a coat of dark blue superfine that emphasized his height without appearing ostentatious, and a cravat arranged with studied casualness that had actually required 3 attempts to achieve the precisely careless effect he desired. The painting, wrapped in protective cloth and secured in an elegant wooden case, sat on his carriage seat beside him as he made the journey from Mayfair to the considerably less fashionable neighborhood of Bloomsbury, and with each turn of the wheels he found his anticipation growing in ways that reminded him uncomfortably of his youth, when such nervous excitement had been common before it was trained out of him by years of ducal responsibility and social calculation. Mrs. Pemberton's modest townhouse stood in a row of similar dwellings that spoke of genteel poverty maintained with dignity, their painted facades showing signs of careful economy in the form of single coats where fashion demanded multiple layers, and window boxes filled with practical herbs rather than decorative flowers. Alexander's arrival created something of a sensation among the neighbors, for ducal carriages were rare visitors to such streets, and he was aware of curtains twitching and faces appearing at windows as his footman knocked at the front door with the silver-topped walking stick that announced his master's presence to those who understood such signals. The maid who answered wore a clean but much-mended apron over a dress that had seen several seasons of faithful service, and her eyes widened with shock when she recognized the Duke of Ravenshollow standing on her employer's doorstep, clutching the wooden case that contained Miss Ashworth's painting as though it were the crown jewels themselves. The drawing-room into which he was shown reinforced his impression of genteel poverty, gracefully managed, with furniture that had once been fine but now showed the careful maintenance that substituted for replacement, and watercolor landscapes that suggested artistic skill applied to decorating walls that could not afford expensive paintings. When Miss Ashworth appeared in the doorway, wearing a morning dress of pale green muslin that had been chosen more for economy than fashion, but which nonetheless emphasized the classical beauty of her features and the intelligence that shone in her dark eyes, Alexander felt his carefully prepared speech evaporate like morning mist before the sun, leaving him standing awkwardly in the center of the small room with nothing but honest emotion to guide his words. "I believe this belongs to you," he said finally, his voice carrying an undertone of amusement that he hoped would disguise the nervousness he felt at this unprecedented departure from the social protocols that had governed every aspect of his adult life. And as he held out the wooden case containing her painting, he found himself holding his breath as he waited for her response. Ravenshollow House rose before Cordelia like a monument to centuries of accumulated power and privilege, its pale Portland stone facade gleaming in the morning sunlight, as though the very walls had been polished to reflect the family's exalted status. The mansion occupied an entire block of Mayfair's most prestigious square, its imposing entrance flanked by Corinthian columns that dwarfed even the grandest residences surrounding it, while wrought-iron balconies adorned with the Blackthorne coat of arms proclaimed the Duke's lineage to anyone who might doubt his consequence. As her modest hackney carriage drew to a stop before the sweeping steps, Cordelia felt her resolve waver for a moment, overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of what she was undertaking. For this was not merely accepting employment, but entering a world so far removed from her current circumstances that she might as well be stepping through a looking-glass into an alternate reality. The livened footmen who appeared to assist her descent moved with the silent efficiency of clockwork, their faces carefully blank as they assessed this unremarkable woman who had somehow earned their master's personal attention, and she sensed their speculation even as they maintained perfect professional demeanor. Mrs. Pemberton had insisted on accompanying her for this first visit, the elderly lady's sharp eyes missing nothing as they were ushered through the marble entrance hall, where classical statues stood in alcoves like silent sentries guarding treasures beyond imagination. And crystal chandeliers cast rainbow fragments across walls adorned with paintings that would have made her father weep with joy to study. That young man didn't buy an entire gallery to acquire a curator, my dear, Mrs. Pemberton had observed with characteristic directness as they sat in her modest drawing-room the evening before, her wrinkled hands steady as she poured tea from her best china service, one of the few remnants of her own more prosperous past. He bought it to acquire you, and while I cannot fault his taste, I do worry about the wisdom of placing yourself in such a position without proper protection or understanding of his true intentions. For dukes are not known for their selfless gestures toward impoverished gentlewomen, however accomplished they might be. Cordelia had protested that the position was purely professional, that His Grace valued her expertise and nothing more. But even as she spoke the words, she remembered the intensity in those storm-grey eyes, the way his gaze had lingered on her face, as though memorizing each feature, and the flutter of awareness that had made her pulse quicken whenever he stood too close during their brief interactions. The tour of the Duke's private galleries left Cordelia breathless with wonder and frustration in equal measure, for while the collection itself was magnificent beyond her wildest dreams, encompassing works that spanned 5 centuries of artistic achievement, the organization was haphazard at best and chaotic at worst, with Renaissance masters hanging beside contemporary portraits without regard for chronology or thematic connection. She found herself standing before a genuine Caravaggio that had been placed next to a rather insipid landscape by a minor English painter, the dramatic chiaroscuro of the former completely overwhelmed by the latter's prosaic sensibilities, while across the room a series of exquisite miniatures had been scattered among larger works like afterthoughts, their delicate beauty lost in the visual cacophony. It became immediately apparent that the Duke's collecting had been guided more by acquisition than appreciation, each piece purchased on expert recommendation or social pressure rather than personal passion, creating a magnificent but soulless assemblage that reflected wealth rather than taste. Alexander himself seemed almost embarrassed as he watched her survey the chaos, his usual confidence replaced by something approaching vulnerability as he observed her cataloguing the collection's shortcomings with the practiced eye of someone who understood not just individual pieces, but the relationships between them. "I fear you'll find the arrangement rather wanting," he admitted as they paused before a Van Dyck portrait that had been positioned where harsh afternoon light would fade its delicate pigments within decades. "My father acquired most of these pieces, and I've simply continued the tradition without much thought for their proper presentation or care, relying on dealers and experts who assured me of their value without considering whether they deserved such casual treatment." Cordelia felt her professional instincts override her social awkwardness as she began to envision how the collection might be transformed, how careful grouping and thoughtful lighting could create narratives that would illuminate artistic development and cultural evolution, turning a mere accumulation of valuable objects into a coherent statement about beauty and human creativity. She found herself speaking with growing enthusiasm about the possibilities, her hands gesturing as she described how the religious works might be arranged to show the transition from Byzantine influences to Renaissance humanism, how the portraits could tell the story of changing social attitudes across centuries. Completely forgetting for the moment that she was addressing one of the most powerful peers in England, as she lost herself in visions of what his galleries could become under proper care. The days that followed established a rhythm that felt both natural and dangerously intimate, as Cordelia threw herself into the work of reorganizing the collection, while Alexander found excuses to seek her opinions on matters that had little to do with art and everything to do with his growing fascination with her mind. She arrived each morning at precisely 9 o'clock, her modest dress and practical demeanor unchanged despite her new circumstances, and immediately lost herself in the careful work of cataloguing and rearranging, creating detailed notes about each piece's provenance and condition while developing plans for their optimal display. Alexander's daily visits to the galleries became longer and more frequent, his initial pretense of checking her progress gradually giving way to genuine conversations about artistic technique and historical context, as he discovered the pleasure of learning from someone whose passion for the subject was utterly authentic. She found herself explaining the significance of brushwork and composition to a man whose education had been purely classical, watching his face transform with understanding as she pointed out details he had never noticed despite years of ownership, and slowly recognizing that beneath his formidable exterior lay an intelligence that had been starved of genuine intellectual stimulation. Their discussions revealed layers of his character that she suspected few people ever glimpsed, moments when his sardonic wit gave way to genuine curiosity, when the mask of ducal authority slipped to reveal a man who had been shaped more by duty than affection, who had learned to command respect, but struggled with the simpler art of human connection. He spoke rarely of his childhood, but she began to piece together a picture of lonely grandeur, of parents who valued his bloodline more than his happiness, of an education designed to produce a perfect duke rather than a complete human being, and she found herself feeling unexpected sympathy for someone whose wealth and privilege had come at the cost of authentic relationships. When she suggested moving the religious paintings to a smaller, more intimate gallery where their spiritual intensity could be properly appreciated, Alexander not only agreed immediately, but asked thoughtful questions about lighting and wall colors. His attention focused not on the commercial value of the works, but on her vision for their presentation. It was during one such conversation, as afternoon light slanted through tall windows to illuminate her animated face, while she described the theological symbolism in a medieval altarpiece, that she caught him studying her with an expression that had nothing to do with art appreciation, and everything to do with a man discovering something he hadn't known he was searching for. The private viewing at the Royal Academy crystallized all the tensions that had been building between them, while simultaneously exposing Cordelia to the full force of society's scrutiny and disapproval in a way that made her position's precariousness unmistakably clear. When Alexander suggested she accompany him to the exclusive event, she had initially protested that such gatherings were hardly appropriate for someone in her position, but his quiet insistence that her expertise would enhance his appreciation of the exhibition had overcome her objections, though she remained acutely aware that accepting his escort was a step that would irrevocably change how society viewed both their professional relationship and her social status. The Academy's grand rooms were filled with London's artistic elite, a glittering assemblage of connoisseurs, critics, and collectors whose conversations created an intellectual atmosphere that Cordelia found intoxicating despite her underlying nervousness about her reception among such exalted company. Alexander's introduction of her as his curator was met with polite interest that barely concealed curiosity about her background and qualifications, though when she began discussing the technical innovations displayed in the evening's featured works, her genuine knowledge quickly shifted the focus from her origins to her insights. Lady Seraphina Montague's arrival changed the dynamic immediately, the acknowledged beauty of the season sweeping into the room like a ship in full sail. Her emerald silk gown and perfectly arranged golden curls creating exactly the sort of visual impact that made strong men forget their own names and practical considerations alike. Cordelia had heard whispers about the stunning young woman who was universally expected to become the next Duchess of Ravenshollow, whose family connections and personal accomplishments made her the obvious choice for a man of Alexander's station. And seeing her in person made those expectations seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. The contrast between Lady Seraphina's polished perfection and her own modest appearance could hardly have been starker, and Cordelia felt every inch the poor relation as she watched Alexander acknowledge his supposed future bride with courteous attention. When Lord Benedict Fairfax, a man whose opinion carried considerable weight in artistic circles, made his comment about Blackthorne's unusual choice in companions while standing near enough for both women to hear, the cutting nature of his observation hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Alexander's response was swift and devastating, his voice carrying the kind of icy authority that could destroy a man's reputation with surgical precision as he informed Lord Benedict that Miss Ashworth possessed more genuine knowledge in her smallest finger than most collectors managed in their entire bodies, and that anyone who questioned her qualifications was merely revealing the limitations of their own understanding. The public rebuke left Lord Benedict speechless, and the surrounding group in stunned silence, but Cordelia found herself mortified rather than grateful. Acutely aware that such protection only emphasized her vulnerable position and the impropriety of her presence in society that was not naturally hers. The remainder of the evening passed in a haze of tension as she struggled to navigate conversations that danced around the obvious questions about her relationship with the Duke, while maintaining the professional demeanor that was her only shield against more damaging speculation. And by the time Alexander escorted her home, she felt drained by the effort of pretending that her world had not shifted dramatically on its axis once again. The arrival of the Dowager Duchess of Ravenshollow at her grandson's Mayfair mansion was announced by a flurry of preparation that transformed the already immaculate household into a state of military precision. For despite her advanced age of 72 years, Helena Blackthorne retained the commanding presence that had made her one of the most formidable figures in society for over half a century. Cordelia first encountered her on a Tuesday morning when she arrived for her usual work in the galleries, only to be informed by the housekeeper that Her Grace desired an immediate interview in the morning room, a summons delivered with the kind of grave formality usually reserved for audiences with royalty. The dowager sat in a high-backed chair, positioned to catch the morning light, her silver hair arranged in an elaborate style that had been fashionable during her youth, but which she maintained with the supreme confidence of someone who set rather than followed trends, her black silk dress relieved only by a magnificent set of sapphires that caught the light like captured stars. Her pale blue eyes, so like Alexander's, but sharpened by decades of social warfare, studied Cordelia with the intensity of a naturalist, examining a particularly interesting specimen, taking in every detail from the careful mending of her gloves to the proud set of her shoulders as she waited for permission to speak. "Tell me, Miss Ashworth," the dowager said without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority that had once terrorized cabinet ministers and cowed rebellious debutantes alike. "What makes you think yourself capable of managing my grandson's affairs? For I have it on good authority that you have somehow convinced him to reorganize his entire collection based on your recommendations, which suggests either remarkable expertise or remarkable presumption on your part." The question was clearly designed to intimidate, but Cordelia found herself responding with honest directness rather than the fawning deference the dowager no doubt expected, explaining her background and training, while acknowledging that her current circumstances were indeed reduced, though her knowledge of art remained undiminished by financial reversal. She spoke of her father's reputation and her own careful study, of the patterns she had observed in great collections, and the principles that guided proper curation, her passion for the subject gradually overriding her nervousness as she warmed to a topic that engaged her deepest interests. The dowager listened in silence, occasionally raising an eyebrow or pursing her lips. But when Cordelia finished speaking, there was something approaching approval in those calculating eyes, though her words remained characteristically blunt. "You speak well for someone of your station," she admitted grudgingly, "and your knowledge appears genuine rather than the superficial accomplishments most young women acquire to attract husbands. But you must understand that expertise alone does not qualify one for certain positions in society, particularly those that might affect my family's reputation and standing." The warning was delivered with surgical precision, leaving no doubt about the dowager's opinion of any romantic entanglement between her grandson and his employee, regardless of the mutual attraction that apparently had not escaped her sharp observation. The conversation continued over tea served from porcelain so fine it seemed to glow with inner light, each cup worth more than Cordelia's quarterly salary, while the dowager's questions probed every aspect of her background and character with the thoroughness of a magistrate examining a suspected criminal. She inquired about Cordelia's family connections, her financial prospects, her expectations for the future, each question designed to emphasize the vast gulf between her circumstances and those required of a duchess, though the interrogation was conducted with such superficial politeness that an observer might have mistaken it for social pleasantries. When the subject turned to Alexander himself, the dowager's manner became even more pointed, her questions about Cordelia's professional relationship with the Duke loaded with implications that made clear she was well aware of the undercurrents flowing between them. "My grandson has always been susceptible to intellectual companionship," she observed while refilling Cordelia's cup with movements that were both graceful and somehow threatening, for his education prepared him admirably for his duties, but left him rather starved for genuine conversation, which makes him vulnerable to the charms of clever women who understand how to appeal to his mind rather than merely his position. The words stung because they contained enough truth to be devastating, forcing Cordelia to confront the possibility that Alexander's interest in her might stem from novelty rather than genuine affection, that she represented merely a temporary diversion from the tedium of his elevated but isolated existence. Yet even as doubt crept into her heart, she found herself defending not just their professional relationship but the integrity of her own feelings, insisting that she had never sought to trade on her position or exploit his kindness for personal gain. The dowager's smile in response was both knowing and pitying, the expression of someone who had witnessed too many such protestations to find them convincing, though she seemed to appreciate Cordelia's spirit even as she dismissed her naivety. "You may indeed believe your motives pure, my dear," she said with devastating gentleness, "but society will judge by appearances rather than intentions, and the appearance of a duke becoming entangled with his employee can lead nowhere that would benefit either party, regardless of the sincerity of the attachment involved." The interview concluded with polite formalities that felt like a sword wrapped in silk, leaving Cordelia shaken by the encounter and newly aware of forces arrayed against any possibility of happiness with Alexander that she had been foolish enough to allow herself to imagine. It was while cataloguing a neglected corner of the collection 3 days later that Cordelia made the discovery that would transform her professional standing and complicate her personal situation in ways she could never have anticipated, for hidden behind a rather pedestrian landscape hung a small canvas that made her heart stop with recognition and disbelief. The painting depicted a young woman in a blue and yellow dress standing beside a window, her face turned toward the light, with an expression of such serene contemplation that it seemed to glow with inner radiance, and every detail from the luminous quality of the pigments to the characteristic way the light fell across the figure proclaimed this to be the work of Johannes Vermeer, one of the rarest and most valuable artists of the Dutch Golden Age. Her hands trembled as she examined the piece more closely, noting the precise handling of light that was Vermeer's signature, the way each brushstroke seemed to capture not just appearance but essence, creating effects that lesser artists had attempted but never achieved with such sublime mastery. The painting had been attributed to Gerard Terborch, a respectable but far less significant artist, and filed away as a pleasant but unremarkable example of Dutch genre painting, which explained why it had been relegated to this forgotten corner where its true genius could remain hidden from appreciation. As she stood before the canvas in growing excitement, Cordelia realized she was looking at a discovery that could revolutionize understanding of Vermeer's work and establish her reputation as a scholar of the highest caliber. For authentication of such a piece would require extensive documentation and scholarly analysis that would bear her name throughout the art world. When Alexander found her there an hour later, still staring at the painting with the intensity of someone who had discovered treasure, her explanation of its significance left him stunned by both the magnitude of the find and the implications for her career. His immediate insistence that she publish the authentication under her own name, claiming full credit for the discovery and analysis, revealed a generosity that went far beyond mere professional courtesy, for he understood that such recognition could provide her with independence and security that would free her from reliance on his patronage. Yet even as she felt gratitude for his support, Cordelia couldn't ignore the painful irony that this triumph might also provide her with the means to leave his employment and remove herself from the increasingly dangerous proximity that threatened to compromise them both. For professional success might prove to be the very thing that forced them apart even as it fulfilled her deepest ambitions. The weeks following the Vermeer announcement brought a whirlwind of attention that transformed Cordelia's quiet existence into something resembling a celebration, as scholars and connoisseurs sought her opinions on attributions and invited her to examine their own collections, eager to benefit from the expertise that had uncovered such a significant masterpiece. Her days became filled with correspondence from museums and universities, requests for articles and lectures, consultations that paid fees substantial enough to provide genuine financial independence for the first time since her father's death. The recognition was intoxicating after years of obscurity. Validation that her knowledge and training had value beyond the confines of Alexander's household. Yet each triumph also emphasized the growing disparity between her intellectual achievements and her social position, creating a peculiar form of success that satisfied her mind while highlighting the limitations imposed by her birth and circumstances. Alexander watched her transformation with evident pride mixed with something that might have been regret. His support for her professional advancement unwavering even as it became clear that her growing reputation was creating opportunities that would inevitably lead her away from Ravenshollow House and the intimacy they had developed through their shared work. Their daily interactions acquired a poignant quality as both recognized that time was running short, that the strange interlude during which they had been able to exist in a space between employer and employee, between duke and commoner, was drawing to a close as the real world pressed its claims with increasing urgency. It was on an evening in late spring, when the galleries were bathed in the golden light that made every painting glow like a jewel, that their carefully maintained professional distance finally crumbled under the weight of emotions too strong to be denied any longer. They had been discussing the placement of several new acquisitions when conversation gradually gave way to the charged silence that had been building between them for weeks, the air itself seeming to shimmer with unspoken desires as they stood before a painting of Venus that seemed to mock them with its celebration of love triumphant. So Alexander's hand reached toward her face as though drawn by forces beyond his control, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the line of her cheek, while his eyes searched hers for permission or rejection. And for a moment that stretched like eternity, Cordelia felt herself leaning into his touch, her own hand rising to cover his, as propriety and passion warred in her heart. But even as their faces drew closer, and the distance between them seemed to dissolve like morning mist, reality intruded in the form of footsteps in the corridor beyond, the sound of servants going about their duties, serving as a harsh reminder of the world that waited beyond this moment of suspended time, a world that would judge and condemn any impropriety between a duke and his employee with swift and merciless efficiency. They sprang apart as though burned, both breathing heavily as they struggled to regain composure, while the magnitude of what had almost happened hung between them like a bridge they had approached, but dared not cross, leaving them both yearning and aching with the knowledge that desire alone could never bridge the chasm that society had carved between their worlds. Lady Seraphina Montague possessed the kind of beauty that artists spent lifetimes attempting to capture, her golden hair and porcelain features arranged with such mathematical precision that she resembled nothing so much as a living Renaissance sculpture. But beneath that flawless exterior lay a mind as sharp and calculating as any politician's, honed by years of navigating the treacherous waters of high society, where a single misstep could destroy a reputation and a well-placed word could elevate or demolish entire families. She had observed the Duke of Ravenshollow's growing attachment to his impoverished curator, with the focused attention of a general studying enemy troop movements, cataloguing every lingering glance, every protective gesture, every departure from his usual pattern of cool detachment that suggested his interest had progressed far beyond the professional courtesy expected between employer and employee. The realization that Alexander's feelings for Miss Ashworth represented a genuine threat to her own carefully laid plans had struck her with the force of a physical blow, for she had spent 3 seasons positioning herself as the obvious choice for his duchess, cultivating his grandmother's approval, aligning herself with his political interests, and perfecting the role of aristocratic wife that generations of breeding and education had prepared her to fulfill with unmatched grace and competence. The thought that all her careful work might be undone by a nobody with unfashionable brown hair and insufficient dowry was not merely disappointing, but personally insulting, an affront to the natural order that dictated dukes married within their own sphere, and maintained the bloodlines that had governed England for centuries. Her campaign against Cordelia began with the precision of a chess master's opening moves, each action calculated to achieve maximum damage while maintaining plausible deniability. For Lady Seraphina understood that direct attacks would appear vulgar and desperate, while subtle manipulation would seem like nothing more than the natural consequence of improper behavior finally receiving its due recognition. She began by mentioning casually to Lady Thornfield, whose opinion carried considerable weight among the patronesses of Almack's, that she found it rather peculiar how much time the Duke spent consulting with his curator, particularly given Miss Ashworth's youth and unmarried status, allowing the observation to hang in the air like a seed waiting for fertile ground, while maintaining the innocent air of someone merely commenting on an unusual professional arrangement. Within days, variations of this observation were circulating through drawing rooms across Mayfair, each retelling adding embellishments that transformed professional consultation into something far more scandalous, the whispers growing from speculation about impropriety to certainty about misconduct as they passed from one eager listener to another. When Mrs. Fortescue, whose salon attracted the city's leading critics and connoisseurs, mentioned at her weekly gathering that she had heard the most disturbing rumors about certain individuals who had clearly overstepped the bounds of their station, every person present understood immediately who was being discussed, and Cordelia's reputation began its inexorable slide toward ruin without a single direct accusation being made against her character or conduct. The systematic destruction of Cordelia's professional standing proceeded with the ruthless efficiency that only someone of Lady Seraphina's social connections could orchestrate, each setback appearing to result from coincidence or changing circumstances rather than deliberate sabotage, though the pattern became unmistakable to anyone paying sufficient attention to the timing and coordination of each blow. The first indication that her position had become untenable came when Sir Reginald Pembroke, who had previously sought her opinion on several acquisitions for his growing collection, sent a curt note declining her services without explanation, followed quickly by similar rejections from other collectors who had once valued her expertise enough to overlook her modest origins in favor of her exceptional knowledge. The cancellation of her planned lecture at the Society for the Promotion of Fine Arts came next, delivered through a secretary who mumbled apologies about scheduling conflicts while refusing to meet her eyes, though Cordelia suspected the real reason lay in the whispered concerns about her moral fitness to address respectable audiences that had somehow reached the Society's governing board. When the National Gallery withdrew their offer for her to authenticate a disputed Caravaggio that had recently come to light, citing vague concerns about maintaining institutional reputation while working with controversial figures, Cordelia finally understood the full scope of the campaign being waged against her and the sophisticated nature of an enemy she had never consciously made. The masterpiece in question was a work that would have established her reputation beyond doubt if her attribution proved correct, representing the kind of career-defining opportunity that came once in a lifetime for someone in her position, and its withdrawal felt like watching her future disappear into darkness, just as dawn had seemed to be breaking over her professional horizons. Dr. Morrison, who had initially contacted her about the project with enthusiasm bordering on excitement, now spoke in the careful tones of someone who had received instruction from higher authorities, his regret seemingly genuine, but his determination to distance the gallery from any association with her absolutely unwavering despite their previous collaboration and mutual respect. The realization that her professional life was being systematically dismantled by forces she could neither identify with certainty nor combat effectively left Cordelia feeling helpless and furious in equal measure, her carefully built reputation crumbling like ancient parchment exposed to sudden light, while she remained powerless to prevent the destruction or even defend herself against accusations that were never made directly enough to be challenged or refuted. Alexander's discovery of Lady Seraphina's campaign came through his own network of informants, gentlemen who moved through society's drawing rooms with the same careful attention to information gathering that his business associates brought to financial markets, and when the full scope of her machinations became clear, his fury was of the cold, controlled variety that wise men learned to fear far more than passionate outbursts. The musicale at his grandmother's residence provided the perfect opportunity for confrontation, the social setting ensuring privacy, while the public nature of the gathering made dramatic scenes impossible, creating exactly the sort of controlled environment where aristocratic warfare could be conducted with maximum effect and minimum spectacle. Lady Seraphina appeared in celestial blue silk that complemented her fair coloring to perfection, her manner as gracious and confident as ever, giving no indication that she suspected her activities had been discovered or that retribution might be approaching with the inexorability of tide returning to shore. When Alexander requested a private word in the conservatory, she followed with the pleased anticipation of a woman who believed she was about to receive the proposal that her campaign had been designed to secure, her smile radiant as moonlight on water and twice as deceptive. "Lady Seraphina," Alexander began without preamble, his voice carrying the deadly quiet that preceded the destruction of political careers and social reputations. "I find myself compelled to address certain rumors that have recently come to my attention, rumors that seem to originate from someone with remarkably detailed knowledge of my household affairs, and an unusual interest in damaging Miss Ashworth's professional standing through whispered insinuations rather than direct accusation." Her composure remained perfect as she arranged her features into an expression of innocent concern, though he detected the faintest tightening around her eyes that suggested she understood exactly where this conversation was leading. "Your Grace?" she replied with the musical laugh that had charmed drawing rooms across London. "Surely you cannot believe that I would concern myself with the affairs of your employees, though I confess I have heard whispers that someone in your position might find troubling, whispers that suggest perhaps the boundaries between professional and personal relationships have become rather blurred in ways that society finds difficult to ignore." The admission was cleverly crafted to sound like helpful warning rather than malicious gossip, but Alexander's expression remained arctic as he absorbed both her words and the calculation behind them. "I see," he said with the sort of smile that had made cabinet ministers resign rather than face his opposition in Parliament. "Then perhaps I should clarify something that apparently requires explanation, Lady Seraphina. Miss Ashworth enjoys my complete confidence and protection, and any attempt to damage her reputation through innuendo or direct attack will be met with consequences that extend far beyond social disapproval. I trust I make myself clear regarding both my feelings on this matter and my capacity for ensuring that those who cross me discover the true cost of their presumption." The Dowager Duchess of Ravenshollow had weathered 7 decades of social upheaval, political revolution, and family scandal with the unshakable composure that came from absolute certainty in her own superiority and divine right to guide lesser mortals toward proper behavior. And when she summoned her grandson for tea in her private sitting room, her manner suggested that she was about to deliver guidance that would brook no opposition or discussion. The room itself reflected her character perfectly, filled with priceless furniture that had survived multiple reigns and family portraits that traced the Blackthorne lineage back to the Norman conquest, creating an atmosphere where the weight of ancestral expectation pressed down like physical force upon anyone presumptuous enough to challenge family tradition. "Alexander," she began without preamble as she poured tea from her mother's Sèvres service, "I believe we must discuss this unfortunate attachment that has developed between you and your curator, an attachment that has become the subject of considerable speculation among persons whose opinions cannot be dismissed as mere gossip or social jealousy." Her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, though Alexander's expression suggested he had inherited enough of her formidable will to mount serious resistance, if necessary. "You are 38 years old," she continued, as though he had not spoken, "quite old enough to understand the responsibilities that accompany your position, and the consequences that follow from neglecting those responsibilities in favor of personal inclination, however powerful such inclination might be. The girl is undoubtedly accomplished, and perhaps even admirable in her way, but she is completely unsuitable as a wife for someone of your station, lacking not merely the fortune and connections that would strengthen your political position, but the breeding that would ensure appropriate guidance for future generations of our family." Cordelia herself stood frozen outside the partially open door, having arrived to retrieve a book she had left in the adjacent library, her intention to announce her presence dying in her throat as she heard her own future being discussed with the clinical detachment reserved for livestock breeding or business transactions. The Dowager continued remorselessly, producing a written list that rustled like autumn leaves as she unfolded it with ceremonial precision. "I have taken the liberty of compiling names of young ladies whose circumstances make them suitable candidates for your consideration, each possessing the requisite breeding, fortune, and accomplishment necessary for a duchess, while offering specific advantages that would enhance your standing in Parliament and society. Lady Seraphina Montague heads the list, naturally, as her father's influence in the House of Lords combined with her personal beauty and accomplishment makes her an obvious choice, though Lady Catherine Pemberton and Miss Arabella Fairfax also possess qualities that recommend them for your serious consideration. The casual dismissal of everything Alexander felt, the reduction of human emotion to political calculation, struck Cordelia with devastating clarity. As she finally understood the full impossibility of their situation and the damage her presence in his life was causing to his future prospects. The galleries of Ravenshollow House stood in perfect arrangement, each masterpiece positioned exactly where Cordelia had specified during her months of meticulous reorganization, yet without her presence to animate them with passionate discourse and scholarly insight, they had become nothing more than expensive monuments to accumulated wealth rather than living celebrations of human artistic achievement. Alexander found himself wandering through the rooms that had once been filled with her enthusiastic explanations, her hands gesturing as she described brushwork techniques or historical context, her eyes lighting up with genuine joy when she encountered a particularly sublime passage of color or composition. And now the silence felt oppressive rather than peaceful. The paintings reduced to mere decoration without her voice to explain their significance and bring their stories to life. He paused before the Vermeer she had discovered, the young woman in blue and yellow who seemed to gaze at him with reproachful eyes, as though she too mourned the absence of the scholar who had rescued her from obscurity and given her the recognition she deserved after centuries of misattribution. The irony was not lost on him that Cordelia's greatest professional triumph had provided her with the means to leave his employment and remove herself from the impossible situation their growing attachment had created. Yet her departure had stripped all meaning from the collection she had so carefully curated, transforming his galleries from spaces of wonder and discovery into mere repositories for objects that held no emotional resonance without her interpretation to give them context and significance. His daily routine, once enlivened by their morning discussions of artistic technique and historical analysis, had become a dreary succession of business meetings and social obligations that felt increasingly meaningless as he struggled to maintain interest in matters that had once commanded his full attention, his mind wandering constantly to memories of conversations that had challenged his assumptions and expanded his understanding in ways he was only now beginning to appreciate. The servants moved through the galleries with the same careful efficiency they had always maintained, dusting frames and adjusting lighting according to Cordelia's detailed instructions, but their mechanical attention to her specifications only emphasized her absence, while failing to recreate the atmosphere of intellectual excitement that had transformed these rooms from displays of wealth into spaces where art and life intersected in profound and moving ways. His performance in Parliament suffered noticeably as distraction and irritability replaced the focused attention that had made him a formidable presence in political debates, his usual sharp wit dulled by preoccupation with matters that had nothing to do with legislation or national policy. Lord Pemberton, his closest ally in the House of Lords, observed after a particularly lackluster speech on agricultural reform that Blackthorne seemed to have lost his edge, his arguments lacking the passionate conviction that had previously swayed undecided votes and intimidated opposition speakers into submission. The social season continued around him with its usual succession of balls, soirees, and intimate gatherings, but Alexander found himself declining invitations with increasing frequency, his presence at events he did attend marked by a distracted air that made hostesses despair of engaging him in conversation, and eligible young ladies abandon hope of capturing his attention through their most practiced charms. Lady Seraphina herself seemed puzzled by his withdrawal, her attempts to capitalize on Cordelia's departure meeting with polite but unmistakably cold responses that suggested her campaign had backfired rather than achieving its intended goal of clearing the field for her own romantic ambitions. The Dowager Duchess, who had expected her ultimatum to produce grateful compliance and renewed attention to suitable matrimonial prospects, instead found herself confronting a grandson whose mood grew darker with each passing week, his responses to her carefully arranged introductions ranging from perfunctory courtesy to barely concealed hostility that made even the most determined matchmaking mothers reconsider their daughter's chances of becoming the next Duchess of Ravenshollow. When she attempted to discuss his obligation to produce an heir and secure the succession, Alexander's response was so cutting that she actually recoiled, recognizing in his tone the same implacable will that had made his grandfather a legend in political circles, but which had never before been directed toward family members who presumed to guide his personal choices. The realization that her victory had produced not gratitude but resentment forced her to reconsider whether removing Miss Ashworth from the equation had actually solved anything, or merely transformed a manageable situation into an intractable problem that threatened to make her grandson as unmarriageable as any social outcast. Cordelia's return to her previous circumstances felt like descending from mountain heights to valley floors, the change in elevation leaving her breathless and disoriented as she struggled to adjust to a world that suddenly seemed smaller and grayer than she remembered. The position with the Thornton family represented a significant step down from her work as curator to a Duke's collection, her duties now confined to instructing two young daughters in the rudiments of artistic appreciation and general education rather than cataloguing masterpieces and making discoveries that could reshape scholarly understanding of entire artistic movements. Yet she threw herself into the work with characteristic determination, finding unexpected satisfaction in watching young minds discover the joy of artistic beauty for the first time. Their enthusiasm reminding her of her own childhood wonder when her father had first explained how painters used light and shadow to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on flat canvas. Mr. Thornton proved to be a kind and considerate employer whose respect for learning extended beyond mere social pretension to genuine appreciation for knowledge and culture, his self-made fortune having failed to diminish his curiosity about subjects that lay outside his commercial expertise. The merchant's daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, possessed natural intelligence that made teaching them a pleasure rather than a chore. Their eager questions about artistic technique and historical context providing welcome distraction from thoughts of galleries and conversations she was determined to put behind her permanently. The modest salary provided adequate support for her simple needs, while the respectability of her position offered protection from the whispered speculation that had made her final weeks at Ravenshollow House increasingly uncomfortable. Yet, despite these practical advantages, Cordelia found herself struggling with a persistent sense of loss that had nothing to do with reduced circumstances and everything to do with the absence of intellectual companionship and emotional connection that had made her previous employment so much more than mere work. Her small room in the Thornton household was comfortable and private, her meals adequate, and her duties clearly defined. But the predictable routine that should have provided peace instead felt like imprisonment after months of engaging with challenging problems and stimulating conversation that had made each day an adventure rather than a burden to be endured. The news of Mr. Thornton's proposal reached Alexander through the same network of informants who had revealed Lady Seraphina's campaign against Cordelia's reputation. The intelligence delivered with the matter-of-fact tone that suggested his sources considered this development unremarkable rather than earth-shattering, though its impact on Alexander felt like a physical blow that left him reeling with emotions he had never experienced before. The thought of Cordelia accepting another man's proposal, of sharing her mind and heart with someone who could offer her security and respectability without the complications that had made their own relationship impossible, forced him to confront feelings he had been trying to suppress since her departure from his household. Mr. Thornton was by all accounts a decent man whose genuine affection for his children's governess was matched by sufficient wealth to ensure her comfort and social position that would shield her from further gossip about inappropriate relationships with aristocratic employers, making him exactly the sort of husband any sensible woman in Cordelia's circumstances would be grateful to accept without reservation or regret. Yet the possibility that she might find happiness with someone else, that her life could continue and even improve without any reference to what they had shared during those months when art and attraction had combined to create something he now recognized as the most meaningful experience of his adult life, filled Alexander with a desperation that surprised him with its intensity and clarity. His friend Lord Benedict, recently returned from an extended tour of European capitals where he had observed various forms of government and social organization, listened to Alexander's carefully edited account of his situation with the patience of someone who understood that certain revelations required time and privacy to emerge fully formed from the confusion of conflicting emotions and social expectations. "Blackthorne," Benedict said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen enough of the world to speak with genuine wisdom rather than conventional platitudes. "You're the Duke of Ravenshollow, master of one of England's greatest fortunes, and holder of a title that traces back to the Norman conquest, which means you can bloody well marry whom you choose without requiring permission from anyone living or dead." The blunt observation struck Alexander like lightning, illuminating a landscape he had been stumbling through in darkness, revealing possibilities he had dismissed without proper consideration, and choices he had assumed were beyond his power to make. Cordelia stood at her bedroom window, overlooking the Thorntons' modest garden, met Thornton's proposal still echoing in her mind, with the persistence of church bells that continued ringing long after the service had ended, the weight of decision pressing down upon her shoulders like a physical burden that grew heavier with each hour that passed without resolution. He had spoken with genuine feeling about his admiration for her character and accomplishments. His offer of marriage presented not as a business arrangement, but as a heartfelt desire to share his life with someone whose company had brought him happiness during months when grief for his late wife had seemed insurmountable, and his obvious sincerity made rejection seem not just ungrateful, but cruel to a man who deserved better than half-hearted acceptance, born of practical necessity rather than mutual affection. His proposal offered everything she had thought she wanted after her father's death had stripped away security and social position, a return to respectability and financial stability that would allow her to pursue artistic interests without the constant anxiety about money that had shadowed every decision for the past 3 years. The merchant had made clear that he valued her mind as well as her character, expressing genuine interest in her scholarly pursuits and promising support for any professional activities that would bring her satisfaction, his attitude toward her intellectual independence refreshingly different from the conventional expectation that wives should abandon all interests outside domestic management once they assumed married status. Yet even as she catalogued the practical advantages of accepting his proposal, Cordelia found her heart rebelling against the sensible choice, her thoughts returning constantly to storm-grey eyes and conversations that had challenged every assumption she held about art and life, to moments when intellectual sympathy had blossomed into something deeper and more dangerous than either wisdom or propriety could approve. The memory of Alexander's touch on her cheek, the way his voice had softened when he spoke her name, the look in his eyes during that moment in the gallery when they had almost crossed the line between employer and employee into territory that would have changed everything, haunted her with persistent intensity that made acceptance of another man's proposal feel like betrayal of something sacred and irreplaceable that might never come again in her lifetime. Alexander's response to learning of Mr. Thornton's proposal was neither the desperate pursuit of a lovesick young man, nor the calculated maneuvering of a politician seeking to reclaim lost ground, but rather the methodical campaign of someone who had finally recognized the true nature of what he stood to lose and was prepared to reshape his entire existence to prevent that catastrophe from occurring. His first action was not romantic, but practical: the establishment of the Ravenshollow Foundation for Artistic Education, with an endowment so substantial that even his business advisers, accustomed to his occasional extravagances, questioned whether such generosity might be excessive for what appeared to be a charitable whim. The Foundation's charter, drafted with the precision of legislation that would survive parliamentary scrutiny, specified that its mission encompassed not merely the preservation and study of artistic treasures, but the education of future generations in aesthetic appreciation and scholarly methodology, with particular attention to providing opportunities for individuals whose circumstances might otherwise prevent them from pursuing serious study in these fields. When the Board of Trustees met to select the Foundation's first director, Alexander presented them with qualifications so specific that only one candidate in England could possibly meet the requirements: her recent work on Vermeer authentication and her innovative approaches to artistic education, making her the obvious choice despite any questions that might be raised about her connection to the Foundation's patron. Cordelia's appointment as director of the Ravenshollow Foundation provided her with professional standing that existed entirely independent of personal relationships, a position that commanded respect in scholarly circles and offered sufficient salary to ensure her financial independence regardless of any matrimonial decisions she might make, though Alexander's real purpose was not charity, but demonstration that he valued her mind and accomplishments enough to create an institution worthy of her talents, rather than expecting her to abandon professional pursuits for domestic obligations. His second initiative proved even more revolutionary in its implications for London society: the establishment of monthly salons at Ravenshollow House, where intellectual merit, rather than bloodline, determined guest lists, and where artists, scholars, political reformers, and progressive members of the nobility gathered to discuss ideas that rarely penetrated the usual social gatherings of the aristocracy. These events scandalized traditionalists, who could not fathom why a duke would open his home to individuals whose only claims to distinction were talent and achievement rather than inherited titles or accumulated wealth. But they attracted some of the most interesting minds in London, and quickly became essential gatherings for anyone genuinely interested in cultural and intellectual development rather than mere social advancement. The Dowager Duchess initially responded to these innovations with the horrified resignation of someone watching her grandson deliberately destroy everything she had spent decades building. But as weeks passed and she observed the transformation in Alexander's demeanor from morose detachment to engaged enthusiasm, she began to reconsider whether his pursuit of unconventional happiness might actually serve the family's interests better than dutiful compliance with social expectations that were slowly strangling his natural vitality. His effectiveness in Parliament increased dramatically once he began advocating for causes he genuinely supported rather than positions he felt obligated to maintain, his speeches on educational reform and cultural preservation carrying conviction that swayed votes and impressed colleagues who had grown accustomed to his earlier perfunctory participation in legislative debates. Lady Seraphina, observing this transformation with the dismay of someone who had won a hollow victory that left her worse off than before, gradually withdrew from active pursuit of a man who had made clear through his actions that her attentions were not merely unwelcome, but actively repugnant to someone who had discovered the difference between calculated compatibility and genuine affection. The social world that had once seemed so eager to facilitate their union now watched with fascination as Alexander demonstrated that a duke's real power lay not in conforming to expectations, but in using his position to reshape society according to his own vision of what constituted worthy pursuits and meaningful relationships. His grandmother's gradual acceptance of his choices came not from surrender, but from recognition that her grandson had found something she had thought impossible in their social sphere, a combination of personal happiness and public effectiveness that made him more formidable rather than less, as he pursued goals that aligned with his authentic interests, rather than inherited obligations that had never truly engaged his passion or intelligence. The morning that Cordelia was expected to deliver her answer to Mr. Thornton's proposal dawned grey and drizzling, the sort of weather that seemed designed to mirror the uncertainty and emotional turbulence that had kept her awake through most of the previous night. Her mind cycling endlessly through practical considerations and romantic longings that refused to align in any configuration that promised peace or clarity. She had spent hours composing various versions of her response, each draft representing a different path her life might take, from grateful acceptance that would secure her future to regretful decline that would preserve her integrity but leave her facing an uncertain future with only the foundation position as anchor against social and financial instability. Mr. Thornton had been kindness itself when he suggested she take time to consider his proposal fully, his understanding of her difficult position evident in his gentle insistence that she should feel no pressure to decide hastily on a matter of such importance to both their futures. Though she sensed that beneath his patient exterior lay the natural anxiety of a man whose happiness depended on her answer. The sound of carriage wheels on cobblestones drew her to the drawing-room window, where she expected to see perhaps Dr. Morrison arriving for his weekly consultation about the girls' progress in their studies. But instead she found herself looking down at the familiar crest of the Duke of Ravenshollow emblazoned on a carriage door that opened to reveal Alexander himself, his tall figure emerging into the grey morning with the purposeful stride of someone who had come to settle matters definitively rather than merely pay a social call. Her heart began beating with such violence that she feared it might be audible to anyone in the same room. Her hands trembling as she watched him approach the front door with the same determined expression she had seen him wear in Parliament when preparing to deliver speeches that would reshape political landscapes through sheer force of conviction and eloquent argument. Mr. Thornton answered the door himself, his surprise at finding a duke on his doorstep evident in the slight widening of his eyes, though his natural courtesy quickly reasserted itself as he invited his unexpected guest into the modest drawing-room where Cordelia waited with the terrible certainty that her life was about to change irrevocably, regardless of whatever words were about to be spoken. Alexander entered the room with the commanding presence that made him formidable in any setting, but when his eyes found hers across the space that suddenly seemed both vast and impossibly intimate, his expression softened into something approaching vulnerability, the careful mask of ducal authority slipping to reveal emotions that made her breath catch in her throat with their intensity and unmistakable sincerity. "Miss Ashworth," Alexander began, his voice carrying across the small room with the resonance that had swayed votes in the House of Lords, though now it held notes of personal entreaty rather than political persuasion. "I hope you will forgive the presumption of appearing uninvited at what I understand to be a moment of significant decision in your life, but I found myself unable to remain silent when circumstances require that I speak truths I should have acknowledged months ago, rather than allowing pride and convention to obscure what my heart has known since the day you first walked into my galleries and transformed mere objects into windows opening onto worlds of beauty and meaning I had never imagined possible." The formal cadence of his speech could not disguise the emotion that underlay each carefully chosen word, his usual aristocratic composure giving way to something more genuine and therefore more powerful as he continued with the sort of declaration that would either secure his happiness or destroy his last hope of winning. The woman whose absence had taught him the true meaning of loss. I have bought galleries and endowed foundations, established salons and reformed social expectations, but none of these achievements matter without you to share them, to challenge my assumptions and expand my understanding in ways that make life an adventure rather than a series of obligations to be discharged with appropriate dignity but minimal enthusiasm. He paused, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the room fade into insignificance, even Mr. Thornton's presence becoming peripheral to the moment that would determine the future course of both their lives. I am not asking you to marry a duke, Cordelia, though that title comes with whatever value you might place upon social position and material security. But rather, I am asking you to marry me, the man who fell in love with your mind before he understood what was happening to his heart, who discovered through your passion for beauty that life could hold meaning beyond political advancement and social achievement, who learned from your integrity that genuine worth has nothing to do with inherited privilege and everything to do with character and accomplishment that no accident of birth can bestow or remove. The declaration hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an abyss, offering passage to a future neither had dared imagine possible, but both had dreamed of during the long weeks of separation that had taught them the true cost of allowing others' expectations to override their own deepest desires and most authentic feelings. Cordelia's acceptance, when it came, was delivered not with the breathless emotion of Gothic romance, but with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who had weighed all considerations and chosen love over security, passion over prudence, though in choosing Alexander she found herself gaining rather than sacrificing the independence and intellectual fulfillment that had always mattered more to her than conventional markers of success or social approval. The wedding that followed scandalized traditional society while delighting progressive circles, the ceremony taking place at Alexander's countryside estate amid the very art collection that had brought them together, surrounded by friends who valued genuine affection over strategic alliance and who understood that the couple's shared passion for beauty and learning promised a marriage based on intellectual companionship as well as romantic love. The Dowager Duchess, won over by Cordelia's genuine affection for her grandson and her dignified response to critics who questioned her suitability as a duchess, became an unexpected ally whose support effectively silenced remaining opposition to a union that had initially seemed impossible, but now appeared inevitable to anyone who observed the couple together. Their honeymoon journey through Italy transformed what might have been mere tourist travel into a pilgrimage through artistic treasures, with Cordelia serving as guide to masterpieces Alexander had previously seen only as investments rather than expressions of human creativity and divine inspiration, their shared discovery of beauty creating memories that would sustain their relationship through whatever challenges the future might bring. 2 years later, their London salon had become legendary among artistic and intellectual circles, bringing together painters and poets, scholars and progressive politicians, in gatherings where ideas mattered more than lineage and where genuine conversation flourished in an atmosphere of mutual respect and shared enthusiasm for cultural advancement. Cordelia sat with their infant daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, while guests debated the relative merits of contemporary versus classical artistic traditions, her attention divided between maternal devotion and scholarly discussion with an ease that would have been impossible in a conventional aristocratic marriage, but seemed natural in a household where love and learning reinforced each other rather than competing for priority. Alexander watched his wife engage passionately with visiting scholars about recent discoveries in artistic attribution. Her expertise, now universally acknowledged, after a series of successful authentications that had established her reputation beyond question, and he realized that in choosing love over convention, he had gained not merely personal happiness, but a richer, more meaningful existence than duty alone could ever have provided. Their marriage had become a model for other progressive couples who refused to accept that romance and intellectual partnership were mutually exclusive, proving that genuine compatibility could transcend differences in birth and fortune when based on shared values and mutual respect rather than mere social advantage or financial calculation. The discovery of another misattributed masterpiece in their collection, a small panel that Cordelia's trained eye had identified as the work of a previously unknown student of Leonardo da Vinci, prompted Alexander's amused observation that she seemed determined to constantly prove herself the superior art expert in their marriage, a comment that earned him a smile holding all their shared love and mutual admiration. "Always," she replied with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust both her professional judgment and her personal choices, her happiness evident in every gesture as she adjusted their sleeping daughter while maintaining animated discussion with guests who had come to value her opinions as highly as they respected her husband's political insights. Their love story had already become legendary in artistic circles, the tale of the Duke who bought a gallery to court a curator becoming proof that sometimes the greatest acquisitions are made with the heart rather than the purse. Though those who knew them best understood that their success lay not in romantic gestures, but in the daily choice to honor both passion and partnership in building a life that satisfied their deepest needs while contributing meaningfully to the world around them.